In 1944, while the world was still on fire, the most powerful men in the most powerful nation on earth sat down in a small resort town in New Hampshire called Bretton Woods. The war wasn't over. The bombs were still falling, but the Americans had already decided what the world was going to look like after it ended. Their plan was breathtaking in its simplicity and terrifying in its ambition. The United States would guarantee the safety of global trade. It would keep the sea lanes open. It would station fleets in every ocean. It would put bases on every continent. And in exchange, the world would prosper. Democracy would spread. And American power would sit at the center of everything, like a sun that every other nation orbited. That deal was never formally signed, never voted on, never put in a single document, but it became the invisible architecture of the modern world. Every phone assembled in China and shipped to Europe. Every barrel of oil crossing the Strait of Hormuz. Every container of grain moving through the South China Sea. All of it floated, quietly and invisibly, on a foundation of American military power. All of it subsidized by the American taxpayer. For 80 years, the world accepted this arrangement as if it were a law of nature. As permanent as the tides, as obvious as the air. And then one morning, America changed its mind. Now, before we go deeper into what that means and where it leads, I want you to hold on to one idea because it is the key that unlocks everything in this story. History moves in cycles of power. Always has. One nation rises to dominance, builds an order around itself, and for a time, that order looks permanent, inevitable, the way things simply are. And then, slowly or suddenly, the costs become unbearable. The will weakens. Rivals grow stronger, and the order begins to crack. It happened to the British Empire. It happened to the Dutch before them. It happened to the Spanish before that. The form changes. The cycle does not. What we are watching today is not a political argument about defense budgets. It is not a story about one unpredictable president. It is the next turn of that cycle. And once you see it that way, everything that is happening, the trade wars, the rearmament, the fracturing alliances, the rise of China stops looking like chaos and starts looking like a pattern that has repeated itself throughout all of recorded history. So let us trace it from the beginning, because to understand where we are going, you need to understand what was built, how much it cost, and who was paying. Picture yourself standing at the edge of a map, a real one, right now, today. Look at the oceans first. More than 100,000 commercial ships move through those waters every single day, carrying everything the modern world runs on. Oil, food, electronics, medicine. Between 80 and 90% of global trade moves by sea. That number is not a statistic. It is the circulatory system of civilization. Now look at the choke points. The narrow passages where all of that blood has to flow. The Strait of Hormuz, that thin strip of water between Iran and Oman, barely 33 kilometers wide at its tightest point. Every day, roughly 20 million barrels of oil pass through it. That is about 1/5 of all the liquid petroleum the entire planet consumes. Every car in Europe, every factory in Japan, every power plant in South Korea, dependent on that bottleneck staying open, move east to the Strait of Malacca, between Malaysia and Indonesia, the main artery connecting the Indian Ocean to the Pacific. Most of the trade flowing between Asia and Europe squeezes through here. On a busy year, more than 80,000 vessels pass through it. That is one ship every 7 minutes, around the clock, without stopping. Then there is Bab el-Mandeb, at the southern tip of the Red Sea, where it meets the Indian Ocean. About 12 to 15% of all global trade passes through this corridor, and we saw recently, in very real and very expensive terms, what happens when it becomes unstable. When Houthi forces in Yemen began attacking commercial ships in this corridor in late 2023 and through 2024, in less than a year there were more than 130 attacks on commercial vessels. Marine insurance premiums jumped by 2,700%. A ship that used to pay $70,000 to insure a single crossing suddenly faced a bill close to $2 million for the same journey. The major shipping lines looked at that math and said, "We are going around Africa instead." That adds roughly 2 weeks to every voyage. 2 extra weeks of fuel, crew wages, port fees, all of it. loaded onto the final price of everything you buy. Egypt lost hundreds of millions in Suez Canal revenues almost overnight. Inflation ticked upward in countries that couldn't find Yemen on a map. This is what one small choke point looks like when it becomes unstable. Now imagine all of them. So who kept these passages safe for 80 years? Who was the force that pirates and hostile navies and rogue states had to calculate against before they even thought about threatening the flow of global trade? The answer is the United States Navy. And there is no close second. 11 nuclear-powered aircraft carriers, each one a floating military city, spread across every ocean simultaneously. The 5th Fleet in the Persian Gulf, the 7th Fleet in the Pacific, the 6th Fleet in the Mediterranean. Hundreds of military bases across dozens of countries, from Djibouti to Diego Garcia to Japan to Spain, forming a global logistics web that no other power in human history has ever come close to matching. This costs money, between $55 and $65 billion a year, just to operate and maintain the overseas bases before you count personnel, weapons, active operations, or the constant modernization that keeping this edge requires. Total it honestly, and you are somewhere between $80 and $100 billion every year. Not to fight a war, just to maintain the presence that prevents one. A Princeton economist named Roger Stern once tried to calculate the cost of just one slice of this commitment, protecting the flow of oil through the Persian Gulf between 1976 and 2007. One region. 31 years, his estimate came out at approximately $8 trillion. $8 trillion. To protect a flow of oil that, for most of that period, America itself was barely using. During those decades, the United States was receiving less than 10% of the Gulf's output. Japan, China, South Korea, India were taking the rest. Under American protection, without contributing a single dollar to the cost of maintaining it. And what did they do with the money they saved? That is where the story becomes extraordinary. Japan is the clearest example. After World War II, the United States helped write Japan's new constitution, and buried in that document was a clause that essentially prohibited Japan from maintaining a military capable of projecting force beyond its own borders. Japan renounced war, and in Japan, with the elegant efficiency that defines everything it does, built its entire post-war economic strategy around that constraint. For more than 4 decades, Japan spent less than 1% of its GDP on defense. 1%. Meanwhile, America, which was providing Japan's security umbrella, was spending between 5 and 10% of its own GDP on its military, depending on the decade. The gap between those two numbers is an ocean of money. If Japan had spent just 5% of its GDP on defense, a reasonable number for a major power, it would have spent roughly an additional $250 billion every single year. Over 40 years, that is $10 trillion that Japan never spent on weapons, that it spent instead on factories, technology, infrastructure, education, and research. That is how Japan became the world's second largest economy. That is how it built the industrial base and the technological capability that came to define Japanese excellence. It was built, in significant part, on a subsidy paid by American taxpayers who had no vote in the arrangement. Germany tells the same story with an extra coat of irony. By 2015, German defense spending had fallen to 1.1% of GDP, barely half of the 2% that NATO had been requesting from its members for years. In 2011, Germany ended mandatory military conscription entirely. The German army became a punchline. In 2018, not one of Germany's 6 submarines was operational. Out of 128 Eurofighter jets in the German Air Force, exactly 4 were coming. This was not negligence. It was a rational economic choice, made deliberately and repeatedly over decades. Germany took the money that would have gone into defense and put it into the social contract instead. Generous pensions, universal health care, subsidized public transport, unemployment benefits that were the envy of the developed world. German workers could retire at 60 in genuine comfort. The average American, whose country was indirectly funding that comfort by maintaining European security, was working until 67 and still struggling to afford a doctor's visit. One analysis added up the accumulated defense spending gap across all of NATO's European members. The total difference between what they had formally promised to spend and what they actually spent. The figure was approximately $828 billion, more than $800 billion that European governments redirected from defense into the welfare of their own citizens, because they knew, at some deep and unspoken level, that America would cover the gap. Now you begin to understand why. Inside America, a question started to build, slowly at first, then louder, then impossible to ignore. Why are we paying to protect people who are living better than we are? Why are American bridges crumbling while German trains run on time? Why are Americans rationing insulin while European children get free dental care? Why are we underwriting a prosperity that our own people cannot access? That question is not new. But for a long time, no one in a position of power was willing to answer it directly. The foreign policy establishment had 100 sophisticated reasons why the arrangement made sense. Stability. Alliances. The liberal international order. Words that sounded compelling in think tanks and sounded hollow to a steelworker in Ohio. Until one man decided to answer it plainly. In September 1987, a New York real estate developer named Donald Trump paid $95,000 to take out full-page advertisements in 3 of America's most prominent newspapers, simultaneously the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Boston Globe. He was not running for anything. He was not promoting a project. He was writing an open letter to the American people about foreign policy. And the argument he made in that letter is almost word for word the argument he is making from the White House today, nearly 40 years later. Why is America protecting shipping lanes for oil it does not need? Why is it defending countries that refuse to pay for their own defense? Why are American taxpayers subsidizing the prosperity of allies who then outcompete American workers? The foreign policy establishment dismissed him. The newspapers ran his ad and then wrote editorials, arguing the opposite. But Trump never changed his mind. He came back to this argument again and again across decades, and when he finally reached the presidency, first in 2017 and then again in 2025, he arrived with the patience and the certainty of a man who had been waiting 40 years to do exactly this. In his first term, the pressure was real, but manageable. He demanded more defense spending. Some allies moved slightly. Most did not move enough. He was frustrated but constrained. In his second term, the pressure became something closer to an ultimatum. On the way to the NATO summit in The Hague in June 2025, a journalist asked Trump directly about his commitment to Article 5 of the NATO treaty. The clause that says an attack on one member is an attack on all the foundational guarantee that the entire alliance is built on. Trump's answer was simple and devastating. Well, that depends on your definition. There are many definitions of Article 5. European capitals went pale. NATO's Secretary General had to appear before cameras and reassure 31 nations that the guarantee was still intact. But everyone understood what had just happened. The American president had told the world that the promise they had been building their entire security architecture around for 70 years was possibly open to interpretation. The result was historic. At that same summit, all 32 NATO members signed on to a new target, 5% of GDP on defense by 2035. Not the old 2% that most countries were already failing to meet, 5% more than double. For Germany, with an economy of 4.5 trillion euros, that means 225 billion euros every single year on defense. France, 160 billion. Italy, 120 billion. Poland, the Baltics, Scandinavia, all of them now locked into a rearmament that would have seemed like science fiction 10 years ago. This is not this is transformation. The Europe that defined itself through welfare states and peaceful integration and the deliberate suppression of military nationalism is being turned, against its own instincts, into a military continent. And here is where the cycle of power reveals one of its bitterest ironies. Who do you think is positioned to sell Europe everything it needs, right now, at scale? Not European manufacturers, who hollowed out their own defense industries during the same decades. They were underspending, not China, not Russia. American defense companies. Go back to January 1961. 3 days before leaving the White House, President Dwight Eisenhower, the man who had been the supreme Allied commander in Europe during World War II, the man who knew the military more intimately than almost any president in history, gave a farewell address that was not a celebration. It was a warning. He called it the military-industrial complex, the web of defense contractors and weapons manufacturers and retired military officers that had fused into a single power center, he said, with interests that did not always align with the interests of the nation. He knew that roughly 1,400 retired officers were employed inside the top 100 American defense companies. He knew those companies had enormous financial incentives to keep the defense budget high, to keep America engaged in the world, to keep the threat environment vivid and alarming regardless of whether the facts warranted it. He warned that this complex was becoming more powerful than elected government itself, and that if America was not careful, policy would start to serve it rather than the other way around. Nobody listened. But now, look at what has happened. For 80 years, American taxpayers funded the security umbrella that allowed Europe to the military-industrial complex was paid by the American public. Now that the umbrella is being withdrawn, European taxpayers will fund the rearmament, and a substantial portion of that money will flow directly to American defense companies. The complex wins when America provides the security. It wins when America withdraws the security. The wheel keeps turning, the money keeps flowing, and the cycle that Eisenhower saw in 1961 continues to spin. He just had no idea how long it would run. Now, while Europe was sleeping and America was slowly growing tired, one other country was watching all of this with great care and drawing its own conclusions. China looked at the American-led order and understood something that most Western analysts were slow to see. It was not a permanent condition of the world. It was a historical phase. One nation, at one moment of unparalleled strength and ambition, had chosen to provide a global public good at its own expense. Safe seas, open trade routes, stable choke points. And that arrangement would last exactly as long as that nation had the will and the capacity to maintain it. History had a lesson here, and China had read it carefully. So while others were enjoying the free ride, China was preparing for the world that would exist after the ride ended. The most visible part of that preparation is the Chinese Navy. Today, China operates more than 370 warships, more in raw numbers than the United States Navy, which fields approximately 280 to 290 vessels. In the same category, by 2030, China's Navy is expected to surpass 400 ships. For the first time in nearly a century, the United States does not have the largest navy on Earth by a vessel count. But China understood something beyond just ships. A navy without a global logistics network is merely a coastal defense force. It cannot project power, it cannot protect trade, and it cannot enforce influence at a distance. So, alongside the ships, China has spent 2 decades quietly building exactly the global infrastructure that a true naval power requires. Western analysts call it the string of pearls, a chain of ports, logistics facilities, and strategic footholds stretching from the South China Sea, across the Indian Ocean, and down the coast of Africa. In 2017, China opened its first official overseas military base in Djibouti, the small country sitting directly at Bab el-Mandeb, the very choke point we discussed earlier, Gwadar Port in Pakistan, leased for roughly 40 years. Hambantota Port in Sri Lanka, handed over after the Sri Lankan government could not repay the Chinese loans used to build it, now leased for 99 years. By various estimates, China has significant influence in 60 or more ports around the world, a global logistics web built not with warships and treaties, but with loans, construction contracts, and patience. But here's the question that matters most. If American power retreats and Chinese power fills the gap, does the world simply continue as before with a different flag on the aircraft carrier? Most serious analysts believe the answer is no. American hegemony, for all its costs and contradictions, produced something like a genuinely open trading system, one where the rules, however imperfectly applied, were broadly available to every participant. Small nations could trade, landlocked countries could access the sea. The public good of open sea lanes was just that. Public. Available to all. A world organized around Chinese power is likely to be more conditional. More explicitly, transactional, aligned to Beijing's political and economic interests in ways that the American system, at its best, was not. Open sea lanes would become a service provided to partners and withheld from rivals. The International Monetary Fund estimates that a full fragmentation of the global economy into competing blocs could reduce global GDP by approximately 7% in the long run. 7%. That is $5 to $6 trillion of annual economic output. Gone. Not redistributed. Gone. Every country pays that price. The rich ones before the poor ones. But ultimately, everyone, and underneath all of this, beneath the defense budgets and the naval expansions, and the trade wars and the shifting alliances, there's one more dimension to this story that almost no one is discussing openly, and it may be the most consequential of all. For 80 years, historians and political scientists have spoken, sometimes with a kind of embarrassed wonder about something they call the democratic peace among wealthy nations. The remarkable fact that the countries of Western Europe, which had spent centuries tearing each other apart in wars of increasing industrial brutality, had simply stopped fighting. France and Germany, which fought 3 catastrophic wars in 70 years, became the anchoring partners of a peaceful continental union. The idea that they could go to war again became, over time, literally unthinkable. But the uncomfortable truth beneath that peace is that it was held in place not only by good values and shared institutions, but by external constraint. The normal Germany in European history, the one that appears repeatedly across the centuries, is not the Germany of open borders and environmental policy. It is the Germany with the most powerful army on the continent. The one that other European states perpetually have to balance against. The same is true of Japan and Asia. The pacifist, aesthetic, inward-looking Japan of the post-war era is historically unusual. It is a product of specific conditions that were imposed from outside and maintained from outside. Remove those conditions, and you do not know what you get. History suggests the reversion can happen faster than anyone expects and further than anyone predicts. Germany is now debating an independent nuclear deterrent for the first time in living memory. France has floated a European nuclear umbrella to fill the gap left by American guarantees. Poland is building the largest conventional army in Europe. The Baltic states are installing border fortifications and training civilian populations for resistance warfare because they no longer believe the American treaty guarantee is unconditional. None of this means another European war is coming, but it does mean that the conditions that made such a war unthinkable are quietly dissolving. And this is the cycle of power in its most dangerous form. Not the dramatic moment of collapse, but the slow unwinding of the structures that prevented collapse, the gradual return of logic and incentives that everyone agreed after the last catastrophe should never be allowed to return. So where does this leave us? The order that emerged from 1945 was not just, it was not equal. America leveraged its security role to extract political and economic advantages that its allies often resented and rarely discussed openly. But it produced something real, something historically rare, something that is very easy to take for granted until it is gone. 80 years without a great power war, the longest such stretch in the modern era. A global trading system that lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. A set of rules that, as imperfect as their application was, made it possible for nations at every level of development to participate in the world economy. That order is now being deliberately dismantled. Not by accident, not by crisis, but by choice. By a president who has been arguing for this outcome since 1987, who believes in his bones that the arrangement was a bad deal for America and who now has the power to end it. The cycle of power does not ask for permission. It does not announce itself with a declaration or a ceremony. It moves through the decisions of thousands of politicians and generals and CEOs and voters, each responding to incentives that seem rational in the moment. And it only becomes visible in retrospect, when historians look back and try to identify the year when the old order began to give way to something new, something harder, something less forgiving. We may be living in that year right now. The free ride is over. The question that remains, the one that will define the next decades, is not whether the old order survives. It will not. The question is, what replaces it? Whether the transition is managed or chaotic, whether the new world that emerges is merely more competitive, or something genuinely more dangerous. History offers no guarantees. The cycle turns, the hegemon fades, the rivals rise, and the world holds its breath while it figures out what comes next. It has happened before. It is happening now. If this story made you think differently about the world you are living in, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if there is a country, a leader, a historical moment, or an economic force you want to understand at this level of depth, leave it in the comments. I read them. I build episodes around them. This channel exists because you show up for it, and I do not take that lightly. See you in the next one.